Okay, gang, so Jason's request, we're going to chapter 9. Think we're going to do a chapter a day, so you know the drill. I'll give you the chapter. Write me a summary, 5 to 7 sentences. They have to be complete. Correct spelling, punctuation, and grammar. And capitalization. How could I forget? Chapter 9. Marta jotted another note to Nick. He's scarier now than he was before. Like Marta and the rest of the class, Nick couldn't stop staring at Smoke. The transformation was incredible. Wendell Waxmo said, "You're tardy, Mr. Scrod." "Sorry, my bike threw a rod." Smoke set down his backpack, removed a thin plastic binder, which he presented to the substitute. "Here's my essay," he said. 500 words, just like Mrs. Starch asked for. Actually, it's 508. A ripple of high excitement passed through the room. Wendell Waxmo opened the binder to the front page, upon which the title of the essay had been centered. "The Curse of the Persistent Pimple" by Dwayne Scrod, Jr. Wendell Waxmo made a foolish mistake of saying the title aloud, which caused an avalanche of laughter. "She told me to make it funny," Smoke said defensively. He seemed uncomfortable being so sharply dressed and the center of attention. "What kind of nonsense is this?" Wendell Waxmo rolled up the binder and shook it in the air. The tuxedo made him look like an orchestra conductor. "Are you telling me that Mrs. Starch assigned you to write a research paper about pimples? Get serious." Despite the teacher's hostile attitude, Smoke remained surprisingly calm. "You want me to read it or not?" "Out loud, you mean?" Wendell Waxmo scowled. "I don't think so, Mr. Scrod. Take your seat." With a sniff of distaste, Wendell Waxmo deposited the Acme essay in his scuffed briefcase. Smoke sat down and, to the astonishment of his classmates, produced a pen and a notebook. In all the time that Nick had known the kid, he couldn't remember ever seeing him take notes. "It's not really him," Marta whispered. "It's got to be an imposter." "Or a secret twin brother," Nick said. Dr. Wendell Waxmo seemed miffed that his limelight had been stolen. He scuttled up to Dwayne Scrod, Jr. and said, "Young man, I intend to find out if you're telling me the truth about this preposterous pimple project, or if it's just some prank you thought up to have a few cheap giggles at my expense." Smoke looked puzzled. "Why would I do a dumb thing like that?" I'm not saying the word. "Because kids always try to take advantage of substitute teachers. That's why. To prey on them, as it were. You think we're just here for your sport and entertainment." Wendell Waxmo inched closer. "I know your type, son," he said, "but I insist on respect. Why else would I go to all the trouble of dressing up like this?" Smoke shrugged. "Because you're a total whack job?" The class exploded, and Wendell Waxmo turned purple. Then he did something that caused the whole class to swallow their laughter. He jabbed a pale, knobby finger at Smoke's nose. "Ooh, you," he said, seething, "owe me an apology." Nick and the other students fully expected Smoke to chomp the substitute's offending finger in half, as he did to Mrs. Starch's yellow pencil. But Dwayne Scrod Jr. shocked them all. He didn't nip, nibble, or even spit on Wendell Waxmo. Instead, he clenched his jaw, took a slight, tight breath, and said, "You're right, bro. I'm sorry." Which prompted Marta to jot another frantic note to Nick. He turned into an alien. If the truth were known, Dr. Dressler had the names of 4 other substitutes who were completely sane and normal. He chose Wendell Waxmo instead, knowing full well that the man was more or less out of his mind. It was Dr. Dressler's belief that if Bunny Starch found out who was teaching her class, she would immediately terminate her leave of absence and rush back to rescue her students. In the meantime, the headmaster braced himself for angry phone calls from Truman parents complaining about Wendell Waxmo's distracting wardrobe, bizarre teaching style, and loony impulses to break out in song. For now, though, Dr. Dressler had a more pressing problem. Would you care for some coffee? He asked Jason Marshall. The detective said no thanks and took a seat. Have you spoken to him yet? Not a word. He just showed up for class this morning, Dr. Dressler said, out of the blue. Did you notice anything different about him? Dr. Dressler chuckled uneasily. Everything about him is different. He's like a whole new person. What do you mean? The detective asked. He looks like a real student is what I mean. He looks like he actually wants to be here. But that's a good thing, right? Certainly, Dr. Dressler said, though privately he was both alarmed and suspicious. When the bell rang, he nervously poured himself another cup of coffee. You'll see for yourself, he said to Jason Marshall. Moments later, Dwayne Scrod Jr. walked into the office. He didn't look like an arsonist. He looked like a future president of the student council. He also appeared perfectly fit and healthy despite having digested Mrs. Starch's pencil. Dr. Dressler introduced Detective Marshall. He'd like to ask you a few questions, Dwayne. No problem. Dwayne Scrod Jr. made himself comfortable at the headmaster's leather sofa. Jason Marshall took out a legal pad. I heard about the incident with Mrs. Starch, he began. Dwayne Scrod Jr. didn't deny it. Is it against the law to bite a pencil? Some of the other kids said you also threatened her, the detective said. She was making fun of me. I guess I got mad, the boy admitted. I told her she'd be sorry if she didn't get out of my face. It was wrong, what I said, definitely. So you didn't mean it? Of course not. Jason Marshall wrote down Dwayne Jr.'s answers. Dr. Dressler couldn't get over how normal the boy looked. He couldn't imagine what had caused such a dramatic change in grooming and attitude. Yet the next day, you didn't come to school, the detective said. Yeah, I skipped. That was wrong, too, Dwayne Scrod Jr. said. Have you ever been out to Blackvine Swamp? Sure, catching snakes. Did you go there on the day of the class field trip? The boy seemed to be expecting the question. No, I went snook fishing down at Marco. There was a mullet run and a big tide. You can ask Benji Osceola. He was on the other end of the bridge. Dwayne Scrod Jr.'s story sounded convincing to Dr. Dressler, but the detective wasn't finished. Dwayne, I'm going to ask you something, and you've got to promise not to get upset. It's my job, okay? No sweat. Did you sneak out to Blackvine Swamp and set a fire to scare Mrs. Starch during the field trip? The boy was true to his word. He stayed cool. He looked Jason Marshall straight in the eye and said, I don't do that stuff anymore. So the answer is no? Most definitely. Did you do anything during the last few days that might have frightened Mrs. Starch into believing your threat was real? She hasn't been back to school since the field trip. Dwayne Scrod Jr. laughed. That lady's not scared of anything, especially a kid. I don't want no more trouble from her. That's how come I did that stupid essay she wanted. Sorry, but it was stupid. Dr. Dressler felt obliged to ask, what kind of essay? Dwayne Jr. rolled his eyes. She made me write a 500-word essay about zits. The headmaster winced. Seriously, the boy said. Dr. Dressler made a mental note to have a diplomatic chat with Mrs. Starch when she returned to school. Discipline a student is one thing. Humiliating him was another. The detective had heard enough about the pimple paper. I'm not done here, he said. Oh, I'm about done here, he said. Thanks for stopping by, Dwayne. The boy rose from the couch. Just a second. One more question, Dr. Dressler said. Dwayne Scrod Jr. turned, a trace of impatience in his eyes. The headmaster said, I'm just curious, Dwayne. Did something in particular happen to bring about this major change in you? What do you mean? Dr. Dressler smiled in a way that he hoped would appear friendly and genuine. The way you're dressed, the way you're acting. Surely you're aware of the difference. Dwayne Scrod Jr. looked down at himself, scratched pensively at the reddish-colored blemish on his neck. I went camping for a few nights, had tons of time to think about stuff. What kind of stuff? Asked Jason Marshall. The way I was heading, mistakes I was making, all the wrong turns. Even the detective seemed touched. That's just part of growing up, he said. Yeah, well, it gets old, the boy remarked, not caring about a dang thing in the world, so I decided to try it the other way. Dr. Dressler nodded sympathetically. Well, we like the new you, Dwayne. It's a solid move, Jason Marshall said. I guess, said Dwayne Scrod Jr., and he excused himself. Dinner was a challenge. I should have made fried chicken, Nick's mother said. Something you could pick up with your fingers. It's okay. I need to nail this. Nick was eyeing the pork chop on his plate, trying to figure out how to cut it. He was able to work the knife pretty well with his left hand, but he couldn't keep the meat from sliding around without his other hand pinning it down with the fork. Let me unwrap your right arm, his mother implored, just for tonight. No way. This is how Dad's got to do it, right? Nick's mother said, I'd cut his food if he were home. You can bet on that. The disappointing news had come in a phone call that afternoon. Captain Gregory Waters was fighting an infection in his wounded arm. The doctors had told Nick's mother that his dad was responding slowly to the antibiotics. On a more positive note, the doctor reported that Dr. Waters' early rehab session was outstanding. Nick was pleased, though not surprised. His father had always kept himself in top physical shape. How come they wouldn't let us talk to him? Nick said, because he was sleeping. They said he had 2 hours with his left arm on the weight machine this afternoon. Sounds like Captain Studley. It does indeed. Nick's mom was watching the pork chops skate back and forth across his plate while he hacked at it with a knife. You're going to starve to death, Nicky. Let me do it, she said. No, I'll get the hang of it. In frustration, he put down the knife and reached for a bread roll, which he gobbled in 3 bites. It's only my first day left-handed, he grumbled through the crumbs. You mean one-handed, his mother said. What'd the other kids have to say? Not much. Marta thought it was cool. How was PE? Fine, Nick said, which wasn't even remotely true. Lacrosse was extremely difficult to play with your best arm bound behind your back, and Nick had been practically useless to his team. Later, while he was in the shower, 2 of the seniors had snatched his ace bandage from the towel rack and used it to hog-tie an overweight, slow-footed freshman named Pudge Powell IV. 2 coaches spent 10 minutes unbinding the boy. So PE class was basically a disaster. His mother said, you're going to be hurting tomorrow. You ought to take a hot bath. Nick didn't argue, though he was embarrassed to admit how sore he was, and it wasn't as if he'd been chomping wood all day. The routine tasks of taking notes, carrying a backpack, opening a few doors, and swinging a lacrosse stick had worn him out. Never again would he take for granted the luxury of having 2 good arms. After soaking for half an hour and then rewrapping himself, Nick confronted his homework, which included 18 algebra problems. At one point, his mom came into the room and peeked over his left shoulder. I'm impressed. I can actually read your answers, she said. I've got no idea if they're right or wrong, but I can definitely read them. Just wait. Can I ask you something, Nicky? How long are you going to keep up this lefty routine? Until I get good at it. Then what? I don't know, Mom, Nick said shortly. I haven't thought about it. In fact, he thought about it plenty. The doctor said that Nick's father would face months of outpatient rehab after returning home. Nick planned to be there with him, practicing all the same left-handed exercises. After finishing his math homework, Nick read an O. Henry story for English, which improved his mood. Then he tackled the chore of brushing his teeth, causing only minor bleeding from his gums. He planned to go to bed with his arm wrapped, but he couldn't get comfortable. His hand kept falling asleep, and Nick became worried that the elastic bandage might cause permanent damage if he dozed off in the wrong position. With some effort, he unstrapped the arm, which felt weak and numb. He made a fist and flexed his muscles several times to get the blood circulating again. Nick already had the lights off and was listening to his iPad when his mother cracked the door open. She said, Wow, it's only 8:30. I'm whipped. She sat down and laid a hand on his forehead, checking to see if he had a temperature. He told her he was fine. You're bummed about Dad? She asked. Nick nodded. Yeah, it sucks. We'll call him tomorrow, I promise. The infection must be pretty bad. Nick's mother told him not to worry. The doctor said it happens sometimes after a battle amputation. The last word jolted Nick. The truth was still sinking in. His father was an amputee. But at least he's alive, Nick said to himself, and that's what really matters. His mother said, I'll be up watching TV for a while in case you can't sleep. Thanks, Mom, but I'm ready to crash. An hour later, Nick was still wide awake. His body was exhausted, but his brain was sparking like a high-voltage wire. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened to his father, imagining the flash from the exploding rocket, the blast of the Humvee bursting into pieces, the flames and the smoke and the screams. Afraid of what he might dream if he shut his eyes, Nick grabbed his cell phone off the nightstand and dialed Marta's number. She answered on the second ring. You awake? He said, keeping his voice low. Surfing Facebook, how lame is that? Extremely. Nick said, You talked to your dad? Not today. He was rehabbing. Marta said, I can't sleep either. I've been thinking about everything that's been happening at school, and here's what I figured out. Mrs. Starch is a witch. Not this again. No, I mean a real witch. Think about it. She and Smoke dropped out of sight at about the same time. Suddenly he's back in school, and it's like he got a complete personality transplant. I bet Miss Starch put a spell on him. Nick laughed. This isn't Hogwarts, Marta. It's the Truman School. I didn't say she was a wizard. I said she was a witch. Whatever. Okay, smarty pants. Let's hear your brilliant theory. I don't have one, Nick admitted. Something weird's going on, that's for sure. Thank you, Marta said. Nick agreed that Mrs. Starch's excuse for taking a leave of absence from school, the so-called family emergency, sounded bogus. The woman hasn't missed a day of school since the Stone Age. Yet even more startling and suspicious had been the appearance in class of the new, improved Dwayne Scrod Jr. Alert, neatly combed, and dressed, academically responsible, a complete stranger, basically. Nick had an uneasy sense of being in one of those short stories that led you off in one direction and then ended up someplace else with a total surprise. And the weirdness had all started on the day that Smoke ate Mrs. Starch's pencil. Marta said, Are you sitting down? I'm lying down in bed. Good. Guess what I saw this afternoon after school? Remember that blue Prius with the Save the Manatee license plate? The one just like Mrs. Starch's car? Well, guess what? It was Mrs. Starch's car. It had to be. How do you know? Nick asked skeptically. Because I saw it flying out of the parking lot of Ace Hardware going like 50 miles an hour. And guess who was chugging a Mountain Dew in the passenger seat? Smoke! Get out, Nick said. Swear to God, in his Truman blazer. But who was driving? Looked like a guy with a black ski beanie pulled tightly over his head. But I bet it was Mrs. Starch. You know, witches can change themselves into anything, Marta said confidently. Yeah, well, who changed you into a space case? There's no such thing as witches, so knock it off. There was silence on the other end of the line. Nick was worried that he'd hurt his friend's feelings. Marta said, You don't believe me. I just don't believe in all that Harry Potter stuff, okay? But I do believe you saw Smoke in the blue car today, Nick said. And I also believe that the car belonged to Mrs. Starch. It's just too freaky to be a coincidence. Marta was relieved that Nick didn't think she'd made the whole thing up. So what do we do now? Now, said Nick, now we've got to find out who's driving smoke around town in Mrs. Starch's car and what they've done with Mrs. Starch. Awesome! Although Nick stayed awake for a while longer, his imagination was no longer consumed by the Baghdad rocket attack that had maimed his father. Instead, he was thinking of the Black Vine Swamp and what secrets it might hold. Wow!